The gavel of a phone call ended a $2 billion deal in less than 10 seconds, and Dante Rocco was still holding the receiver when the room went silent around him. 12 men in dark suits stared at him, waiting for an explosion that did not come. Instead, Dante set the phone down slowly, as if it might shatter, and asked one question in a voice that made the air feel thinner. "Who is Clara Bennett?" Nobody answered right away. His lawyer, a nervous man named Peter Doyle, finally cleared his throat and explained that Clara Bennett was the independent evaluator assigned by the regulatory board to certify the shipping conglomerate acquisition. Her job was simple. She reviewed the books, checked the numbers, confirmed everything was clean, and signed off so the deal could close. It was supposed to take 3 days and end with a rubber stamp. Instead, she had spent 11 days combing through records nobody thought anyone would read that closely, and this morning, she had submitted her official score. 0. Not a low score, not a flagged concern. A flat, absolute 0, with a written explanation that the acquisition target's financial structure showed signs of systemic fraud, and that approving it would expose the regulatory board, the banks, and every investor involved to catastrophic liability. Dante had built his life on being the man nobody said no to. He had inherited an empire from his father, expanded it through decades of careful, ruthless business decisions, and reached a point where his name alone opened doors that stayed shut to everyone else. This acquisition was supposed to be his masterpiece, the deal that would let him move his organization into the light, layer his fortune through legitimate shipping routes, and finally step back from the shadows his father had never managed to escape. $2 billion was not just money. It was a doorway, and a woman he had never met had just slammed it shut with a single number. The room had gone quiet in a way Dante had not experienced in years, the kind of silence that came from 12 grown men, suddenly unsure whether to speak. He let the silence sit for a moment, using it the way his father had taught him, letting people fill the space with their own fear rather than filling it himself. "Get me everything on her," he said finally. "Not threats, information. I want to understand what kind of person does this." He asked for her file. Doyle hesitated before sliding a folder across the table, and Dante opened it to find a photograph clipped to the corner. Clara Bennett looked to be in her early 30s, with sharp hazel eyes and dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had no patience for anything that wasted her time. Her credentials were extensive. Top of her class in forensic accounting, 5 years at a federal oversight agency before going independent, a reputation for being impossible to bribe, intimidate, or fool. She had turned down offers from firms that would have tripled her salary because, according to a quote buried in an old industry profile, she did not want to owe anyone anything that might cost her the truth later. Dante read that line twice. He thought about the parade of accountants, lawyers, and evaluators who had passed through his life over the years, each one eventually finding a comfortable arrangement that let them sleep at night while looking away from whatever needed to be ignored. He had never once had to work particularly hard to secure their cooperation, a larger fee, a subtle reminder of what could happen to a career, a quiet dinner where nothing needed to be said directly. It had always been enough. He wondered what it would take with a woman who had already refused offers 3 times the size of her current salary, simply because she did not want to be indebted to anyone. There was also this, Doyle added, sliding a second sheet across the table. Her personal history. Nothing dramatic, but you asked for everything. Dante scanned it quickly. Clara Bennett had grown up outside the city in a small town, where her father ran a modest hardware store that had gone under during an economic downturn, undone not by his own mistakes, but by a corrupt supplier who had falsified inventory numbers for years before the fraud finally collapsed the business. She had been 17 when it happened, old enough to watch her father lose everything he had built through no fault of his own, and old enough to decide, in that moment, exactly what she wanted to do with her life. She had gone into forensic accounting not for the salary, but because she had once watched a lie destroy her family, and had promised herself she would spend her career making sure that kind of lie never went unnoticed again. Dante closed the folder slowly, understanding for the first time that Clara Bennett was not simply thorough. She was driven by something personal, something that made bribery meaningless, and threats counterproductive. A woman like that did not bend because the stakes got higher. She held firmer. That evening, Dante sat alone in his penthouse, the folder still open on the table in front of him, and found himself doing something he had not done in a long time. He was thinking, not about how to solve a problem, but about a person. He thought about a 17-year-old girl watching her father's life work collapse because someone had decided the truth was inconvenient, and he thought about the small, precise number she had written at the bottom of his own acquisition, a number that had cost him $2 billion and had cost her, if his contacts were right, at least one very angry phone call from the regulatory board asking her to reconsider. She had not reconsidered. By the next morning, the fallout had already started. News of the failed evaluation had leaked to 2 financial outlets, and Dante's rivals were reaching out to his usual banking contacts, testing to see if the deal's collapse meant his empire was finally cracking. Old associates who had not called in months suddenly wanted to have coffee. Competitors who had spent years quietly circling his territory began making small, probing moves, testing whether the wounded animal was truly wounded or simply resting. Dante answered none of the calls personally. He let Doyle handle the press inquiries with careful, non-committal statements, and he let Victor handle the whispers moving through the underworld with a firmness that reminded everyone exactly who still controlled the largest share of the city's shipping routes, legal and otherwise. But privately, in the quiet hours before dawn, Dante found himself returning again and again to the same question. Not how to salvage the deal, not how to punish the woman who had ended it, but why her refusal bothered him so much less than it should have. His underboss, a heavy-set man named Victor Cole, sat across from him in his office, with his arms crossed, clearly annoyed that a single evaluator had undone 11 months of careful negotiation. "We handle her," Victor said, quietly. "Make the report disappear, make her disappear from the equation. Find someone easier to work with." Dante did not answer immediately. He walked to the window of his office, looking down at the city that had made his family both feared and wealthy, and thought about the version of himself that would have agreed with Victor without hesitation 5 years ago. That version of him would have already sent someone to have a quiet conversation with Clara Bennett, one that ended with her signature on a revised report. But something about the certainty in her written explanation, the total absence of fear in her wording, made him curious in a way he did not like. Victor was still pacing when Dante finally spoke again, his voice carrying the flat, unshakable calm that everyone in the organization had learned to recognize as final. "I want to understand her methods before I decide anything," Dante said. "If she's this precise about a shipping company's books, imagine what she'd find if someone pointed her at us directly. I'd rather know what that looks like from across a table than read about it in a subpoena." Victor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, recognizing the particular tone that meant the conversation was over regardless of how much he disagreed. "Set up a meeting," Dante said instead. "I want to talk to her myself." Victor frowned. "She won't agree to that." "Then convince her." Victor pushed back hard against the idea of any meeting at all. He argued that speaking with Clara directly gave her power she had not earned, that it validated her decision by treating it as something worth discussing, rather than something to be corrected through more conventional channels. Dante listened to every argument patiently, and then dismissed each one in turn, unwilling to explain, even to his own second-in-command, that some part of him needed to understand this woman before he decided what to do about her. It took 3 days, and a call from Peter Doyle, framed carefully as a professional courtesy meeting, to discuss the technical details of her findings, before Clara Bennett agreed to sit down with Dante Rocco. She chose the location herself, a public cafe near the financial district, in the middle of the afternoon, surrounded by people. Dante noticed the choice and respected it. It told him she was careful, not fearful. There was a difference, and he had learned to recognize it. She was already seated when he arrived, a folder in front of her, a cup of black coffee untouched beside it. She did not stand when he approached the table, did not offer her hand, and did not smile. She simply gestured to the chair across from her, as though she were the one who had called the meeting. "Mr. Rocco," she said, "you have 11 days of my work in that folder, if you actually want to discuss it. If you're here to ask me to change my answer, you can save both of us the time." The cafe buzzed quietly around them, ordinary people going about ordinary afternoons, entirely unaware that the man settling into the chair across from Clara Bennett controlled more money and more danger than most of them would encounter in a lifetime. Dante had chosen not to bring anyone with him, a decision that had made Victor visibly uneasy that morning, but one that felt necessary to Dante himself. Whatever this conversation was going to be, it needed to happen without an audience. Dante sat down slowly, studying her the way he studied every negotiation, looking for the tell, the crack, the place where pressure might work. He found nothing but steady eye contact. "I read your report," he said. "Every line. You didn't just find irregularities. You found a pattern that goes back 6 years, hidden across 4 subsidiary companies. That's not a routine catch. That's obsessive work. It's called doing my job properly," Clara said. "Most evaluators stop at the first clean quarter they find and assume the rest follows the same pattern. I don't assume anything. I verify everything, every time, no exceptions. Even when the client is the kind of man people don't usually say no to. Especially then," she said, and for the first time there was something sharp in her voice, almost a challenge. "That's exactly when it matters most, Mr. Rocco. The bigger the name attached to the money, the more likely people are to look away from what the numbers are actually saying. I don't look away." Dante leaned back in his chair, feeling something unfamiliar stir in his chest, a mixture of frustration and genuine admiration he had not felt in longer than he could remember. Every person in his life either feared him or wanted something from him, and usually both. Clara Bennett looked at him the way she might look at a stubborn column of numbers that refused to balance, an obstacle to be solved through patience and precision rather than through fear. "You understand what this deal meant," he said quietly. "Not just the money, what it represented." "I understand what the deal represented on paper," she said. "A legitimate acquisition that would have laundered questionable capital through a shipping network with falsified compliance records. I don't need to understand anything beyond that to know it deserved a 0. He studied her more closely as she spoke, noting the way her hands stayed perfectly still on the table, the way her eyes never once drifted toward the door or the other patrons around them, the way most people's did when nervous. She was not performing courage for his benefit. She simply did not feel the fear he expected to see, and that absence unsettled him more than open defiance ever could have. "You've had threats before," he said. "People like the ones I could send." "I've had threats," she confirmed. "Lawsuits. A car that followed me home for a week once, courtesy of a construction firm I flagged for skimming pension funds. I reported it to the police, kept doing my job, and eventually the firm went under anyway, because the truth doesn't stop being true just because someone gets nervous about it." The bluntness of it should have angered him. Instead, Dante found himself almost smiling, a rare and strange sensation. "You're not afraid of me," he said. Clara finally picked up her coffee, taking a slow sip before answering, her eyes never leaving his. "I've spent my career being afraid of powerful men who thought their power meant the truth didn't apply to them," she said. "I decided a long time ago that fear doesn't belong in my work. If I start being afraid of the people I evaluate, I stop being useful to anyone, including myself." Dante studied her for a long moment, turning the words over in his mind. He had come to this meeting expecting to find leverage, some hidden weakness he could use to make the problem disappear, the way problems always disappeared in his world. Instead, he found himself facing someone who had already calculated every risk of sitting across from him and decided the truth was worth it anyway. "What would it take," he asked carefully, "to convince you that I'm not the man your report makes me look like?" Clara set down her coffee cup and studied him with an expression that was almost curious, almost gentle, though her words remained precise. "I don't evaluate character, Mr. Rocco," she said. "I evaluate numbers. And the numbers in that acquisition told a very clear story about the company you were trying to buy. If you want a different evaluation of who you are as a person, that's a conversation for someone else, not me. But you're curious," he said. "I can see it. You wonder if there's more to the story." For the first time since he had sat down, something flickered across her face that might have been uncertainty, quickly replaced by composure. "I'm always curious," she said. "It's what makes me good at my job. But curiosity doesn't change facts. And it definitely doesn't change scores. I don't need a different evaluation of who I am, Dante said quietly. I need to understand why one honest answer from a stranger bothers me more than every threat I've ever received from an enemy. Clara considered that for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before answering with a precision that matched everything else about her. Maybe because threats confirm what you already expect from the world, she said, and honesty doesn't. It's harder to prepare for something you're not used to receiving. They talked for almost an hour after that, the conversation shifting away from the deal itself and into something neither of them had expected, an exchange about the industry, about the pressures of independent evaluation work, about the strange, exhausting weight of being the only honest voice in a room full of people who wanted a different answer. Dante found himself listening more than he spoke, something he rarely did with anyone. Clara, for her part, seemed surprised at her own willingness to keep talking, glancing at her watch twice, as though reminding herself she had somewhere else to be, and staying anyway. She told him, almost reluctantly, about the hardware store her father had lost, about the supplier whose falsified numbers had quietly bled the business dry over 3 years before anyone noticed, about watching her father sign the final closing papers, with hands that would not stop shaking. She had not planned to share that story with him, and something in her expression suggested she rarely shared it with anyone, but the words came anyway, drawn out by a conversation that had somehow slipped past the careful walls she usually kept in place. Dante listened without interrupting, recognizing in her story an echo of something familiar from his own life, a father whose choices had shaped everything that came after, though the shapes those choices had left behind could not have been more different. That's why the 0, he said quietly, understanding settling over him. It was never really about my deal. It was entirely about your deal, Clara corrected, some of her guardedness returning. But you're right, that I don't forget what it costs people when someone decides the truth is inconvenient. I've made sure I never will. When she finally stood to leave, she gathered her folder and looked down at him with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, simply direct. The 0 stands, Mr. Rocco, she said. Nothing about this conversation changes what I found in those books. If you want a passing evaluation, fix the company, don't fix me. She walked out of the cafe without looking back, and Dante sat alone at the table for a long time afterward, staring at the door she had disappeared through, aware of a feeling he had almost forgotten existed. Somewhere beneath the fury of watching $2 billion slip away, underneath the frustration of a plan collapsing in front of him, there was something else entirely. Respect. Genuine, unwilling respect for a woman who had looked directly at his empire and refused to blink. Dante remained at the cafe for nearly 20 minutes after she left, turning her words over in his mind, aware that something fundamental had shifted in him during the course of a single conversation, though he could not yet name exactly what it was. He had entered the meeting expecting to find a weakness to exploit, or a price he had simply not yet offered. He left instead, with the unsettling awareness that he had met someone entirely outside the logic his life had always operated on, and that the usual rules no longer seemed to apply. That night, Victor Cole came to his office again, this time with a printed list of names, men who could make problems disappear quietly and permanently. He set the list on Dante's desk without a word, waiting for approval that had always come easily in the past. Dante looked at the list for a long moment, then pushed it back across the desk. No, he said. Victor stared at him as though he had misheard. Dante, the deal is dead. She killed it. If word gets out that a single evaluator embarrassed you like this and walked away untouched, everyone will start thinking they can do the same. You know how this works. You taught me how this works. I know exactly how it works, Dante said, his voice flat and final. And I'm telling you no. Find another way to protect the organization. She's not part of the solution I'm looking for. Victor left the office looking troubled, and Dante remained behind, staring out at the city lights, turning over a decision he did not fully understand himself. Every instinct that had built his empire told him to eliminate the threat cleanly and move on to the next opportunity. But another instinct, quieter and far less familiar, told him that Clara Bennett was not a threat to be eliminated. She was something else entirely, something he had never encountered inside the walls of his world. A person who could not be bought, could not be frightened, and could not be controlled. He thought about his father, a man who had ruled through fear so absolute that even his closest allies had never fully trusted him, and who had died alone in a hospital room with only paid guards for company, because he had never once allowed himself to trust another person completely. Dante had spent years telling himself that the isolation was simply the price of power, an unavoidable cost of the life he had inherited. Sitting in his office long after Victor had left, staring at a photograph of a woman who refused to be moved by money or fear, Dante began to wonder, for the first time in his adult life, whether that isolation had ever actually been necessary at all. For a man who had spent his entire life believing that everything and everyone had a price, that realization was more dangerous than any zero she could have written on a page. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at Clara's office, with no return address, containing a single sheet of paper. It was not a threat, not an offer of money, not an attempt at manipulation. It was a formal letter, professionally written, requesting a second evaluation, this time of a different, smaller shipping subsidiary, fully disclosed and unconnected to the failed acquisition. At the bottom, in handwriting instead of print, was a short note. No pressure, no expectations. Just the truth, whatever it turns out to be. Dr. Clara read the note 3 times before setting it down on her desk, staring at it with an expression that mixed suspicion and something else she was reluctant to name. She had built her career and her entire sense of self around never being swayed by the powerful men who crossed her desk. But there was something in the simplicity of that note, in the absence of any attempt at persuasion, that unsettled her far more than an outright bribe would have. She picked up her phone, dialed the number listed beneath the letterhead, and when Dante Rocco answered on the second ring, she asked the only question that mattered to her. Why? Because you were the first person in my life who told me the truth, without caring what it cost you, Dante said quietly. And I think I need more of that, whatever the numbers say. Clara sat in silence for a long moment, staring out her office window at a city that had never once slowed down for her. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not immediately know what to say. The second evaluation took Clara 18 days instead of the usual 10, not because the subsidiary was complicated, but because she found herself double-checking every figure twice, aware that Dante Rocco was watching this one far more closely than the last. She told herself it did not matter who was watching. The numbers were the numbers, but she caught herself thinking about their conversation at the cafe more often than she wanted to admit, replaying the moment he had pushed back against Victor Cole's silence, wondering what kind of man refused to eliminate a problem that could destroy his empire. She did not know about that conversation directly. She only knew that no threats had come, no lawyers had shown up demanding a different result, and no strange men had followed her home from work. In her experience, that kind of restraint from a man like Dante Rocco was rarer than an honest set of books. She had reviewed dozens of powerful men over the years, and nearly all of them had responded to a damaging finding with some version of pressure, whether it came dressed as a lawsuit, a lobbying call to her licensing board, or simply a quiet, unspoken threat carried in the tone of a phone call. Dante had done none of that. He had simply sent a letter, respectful and plain, asking her to look at something new. She kept turning the strangeness of it over in her mind while she worked, unable to decide whether it made him more trustworthy or more dangerous, since a man patient enough to wait rather than force his way through a problem was, in some ways, harder to read than one who acted on instinct. When she finally submitted her second report, the subsidiary passed with a strong score, clean records, transparent ownership, no hidden liabilities. She attached a short note of her own at the bottom of the official document, something she had never done before in her career. This company is legitimate. I have no reason to believe otherwise, and every reason, based on the evidence, to certify it as such. Dante read the note standing in his office at midnight, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to pride that had nothing to do with money or power. It was the pride of being seen clearly by someone who had no reason to lie to him, and had chosen not to. He called her the next morning, not through Doyle, not through an assistant, but on the direct line she had used to reach him days earlier. "I got your report," he said. "I assumed you would, Clara replied, her voice carrying its usual composure, though something in it had softened slightly since their last conversation. It's accurate. You should be proud of that subsidiary. It's one of the few genuinely clean operations I've seen this year. There was a pause on the line, comfortable rather than awkward, before Dante spoke again. Have dinner with me, he said. Not a business meeting, not an evaluation, just dinner. Clara hesitated, and in that hesitation, Dante could hear the calculation happening on the other end of the line, the same careful weighing of risk and reward she brought to every set of financial statements she reviewed. That would be a conflict of interest, she said finally. I still have 3 pending evaluations connected to your organization. Then we wait until they're finished, Dante said. I'm not asking you to compromise your work, Clara. I'm asking you to have dinner with a man who's genuinely curious about who you are, outside of a spreadsheet. She was quiet for a long moment before answering. Ask me again when the evaluations are finished, she said, and hung up before he could respond. Dante set the phone down slowly, a small, unfamiliar smile crossing his face. It was not a rejection. It was a boundary, precise and deliberate, exactly the kind of answer he had come to expect from her, and somehow, that made him want to know her even more. In the days after the break-in that had not yet happened, before either of them knew what was coming, life settled into something neither had expected. Clara found herself checking her phone more often than she needed to for a case that was technically closed, and Dante found reasons to call her office with questions that could easily have waited, or not been asked at all. The weeks that followed brought a strange, careful rhythm between them. Clara completed the remaining evaluations with the same rigor she applied to everything, flagging 2 smaller issues in a warehousing contract that Dante corrected without argument the moment she brought them to his attention. He found himself changing procedures across his organization, not because regulations demanded it, but because he did not want to disappoint a woman who had made honesty the entire foundation of her existence. Victor Cole noticed the shift before anyone else did. He watched Dante review contracts personally instead of delegating them, watched him ask questions about compliance that he had never bothered with before, and grew increasingly uneasy about the influence one outside evaluator seemed to have over a man who had never answered to anyone. Victor had watched Dante's father build the organization from nothing, had stood beside Dante himself through a dozen crises that would have broken lesser men, and had never once seen him defer to an outsider's judgment the way he now deferred to Clara's. It frightened him more than he was willing to admit, not because he doubted Dante's strength, but because he had learned long ago that the moment a man like Dante allowed himself to care about someone completely, that person became the single greatest vulnerability in his entire life. This isn't like you, Victor said one evening, standing in Dante's office with a mixture of concern and frustration. You're letting her change how we operate. She's not family. She's not even an ally. She's an outsider who almost destroyed us. She didn't almost destroy us, Dante said calmly. She showed us where we were vulnerable. That's not the same thing. And if she decides one day to hand everything she knows to federal investigators, instead of writing it in a private report, Victor pressed, what happens to us then? Dante did not have an immediate answer, and the absence of one troubled him more than he let Victor see. He trusted Clara Bennett in a way that defied every lesson his father had taught him about power and vulnerability, and he could not fully explain why, even to himself. Victor left the conversation unsatisfied, and that night he did something he had never done before without Dante's knowledge. He quietly assigned one of his own men to keep a discreet watch on Clara's building, not to threaten her, he told himself, but simply to understand who else might be paying attention to her work. It was a small, cautious decision, made out of loyalty to an organization he feared was drifting away from the principles that had always kept it safe. He did not yet know how much that quiet decision would matter in the days ahead, or how close it would come to costing someone their life. The answer came sooner than either of them expected, in a way neither of them could have predicted. It started with a phone call late on a Thursday night, Clara's number appearing on Dante's phone at an hour she had never called before. Her voice, when he answered, carried a tension he had never heard from her. Someone broke into my office, she said. Nothing was taken that I can find, but my files were disturbed, specifically, the files on your organization. Dante was already moving toward the door before she finished the sentence. pulling on his coat, signaling for his driver. "Are you safe?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "I'm at home now," she said. "I called the police already." But Dante, whoever did this, knew exactly which files to look for. This wasn't a random break-in. It was the first time she had used his first name, and even in the middle of her fear, he noticed it. "Stay where you are," he said. "Lock every door. I'm coming." The drive to her apartment felt longer than it should have. Every red light an unbearable delay. Every slow car ahead of his driver a small torment. Dante called two of his most reliable men on the way, giving instructions in a low, controlled voice that nonetheless carried an urgency neither of them had heard from him in years. 20 minutes later, Dante arrived at her apartment building, two of his most trusted men positioned outside without being asked, a silent promise of protection that required no explanation. Clara opened the door, still visibly shaken, her usual composure cracked at the edges, and for the first time since he had met her, she did not immediately push him away when he stepped inside and studied her carefully, checking that she was truly unharmed. "Talk to me," he said. "Everything. What exactly happened?" She walked him through it. The broken lock on her office door, the specific drawer that had been opened, the folder pulled out and left slightly askew, as though whoever had taken it had been careful, professional, and interrupted before finishing the job. It was not a robbery. It was reconnaissance, or worse, an attempt to steal evidence that could be used against her before it could be used against someone else. Dante's mind raced through the short list of people who could have known which files mattered enough to steal, narrowing quickly to the one name that made the most sense. Whitfield. Or someone working for him. It was the only explanation that fit the timing, coming so soon after Clara's report had first threatened to expose exactly the kind of fraud a man like that could not survive having made public. "This wasn't one of my men," Dante said firmly, watching her face for any flicker of doubt. "I need you to believe that." "I believe you," Clara said quietly, and the certainty in her voice surprised them both. "If you wanted those files gone, you wouldn't send someone to steal them. You'd simply ask me, and depending on how you asked, I might even consider it." Dante almost laughed, despite the tension in the room, struck again by her strange, unwavering honesty, even in a moment of genuine danger. "Then who?" he asked. "Someone who benefits, if the truth about that failed acquisition never fully comes to light," Clara said slowly, thinking it through as she spoke. "Someone connected to the shipping company you tried to buy. If my findings become public in a federal investigation, it's not just your deal that collapses, it's their entire operation, and every person who profited from hiding what I found in those books." Dante's expression darkened as the pieces started falling into place. The acquisition target's leadership had far more to lose from exposure than he did. If Clara's files disappeared, or if Clara herself was silenced before she could testify to what she had found, the fraud she had uncovered would vanish along with her, and the people responsible would walk away untouched. "You're in danger because of what you found, not because of me," Dante said quietly, and for the first time, real anger stirred in him at the thought of anyone threatening her over something she had done with total integrity. Clara looked at him for a long moment, studying his face the way she studied a column of numbers that did not yet add up. "Then help me protect the truth," she said, "not by making it disappear, by making sure it survives long enough to matter." Dante nodded slowly, something settling into place inside him, a decision forming with a clarity he had not felt in years. "I will," he said, "whatever it costs me." He stayed with her until well past midnight that night, refusing to leave until she had eaten something, refusing to leave until the locksmith he had called personally finished installing a heavier bolt on her door. Clara protested twice that she did not need looking after, and both times, Dante simply continued what he was doing without argument, until finally, she stopped protesting and let herself sit quietly on the couch, watching a man the world feared move through her apartment with a careful, protective focus she had never once expected to see directed at her. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, when he finally sat down across from her. "I know," he said. "I want to." It was a small sentence, but it settled something in her that she had not realized needed settling, a quiet reassurance that his concern was not a transaction, not a debt to be collected later, simply a fact about who he had decided to be around her. By morning, Dante had moved two of his most trusted people into positions outside Clara's apartment and her office, quiet, professional, and unmistakably present. He did not ask her permission first, and when she noticed them stationed at both locations, she called him immediately, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone unused to being protected without consent. "I can take care of myself," she said. "I don't need guards following me like I'm one of your assets." "I know you can," Dante said, his voice softer than she expected. "This isn't about doubting that. It's about not wanting to find out the hard way what happens if I don't act now." "You're not an asset," Dante said. "You're a target, and until we know who broke into your office, that's not a risk I'm willing to leave unmanaged." Clara was quiet for a moment, weighing the offer against her instinct to reject anything that felt like control. "Two conditions," she said finally. "They stay outside, not inside my space, and the moment this is resolved, they're gone. I won't be someone who needs permanent protection to do her job." "Agreed," Dante said, relief evident in his voice even through the phone. He hung up and stood for a moment in his office, thinking about how strange it was that a woman who had once treated him as nothing more than the subject of a routine evaluation now trusted him enough to accept his protection, even on her own careful terms. It felt like a fragile kind of progress, the sort that could be undone by a single wrong move, and he was determined not to make one. Over the following days, Dante quietly began investigating the shipping company's leadership, using contacts and resources far outside anything a normal evaluation would involve. What he found confirmed Clara's suspicion and went further than either of them expected. The company's chief financial officer, a calculating man named Gerald Whitfield, had been running the fraudulent structure for years, using shell companies to hide losses and inflate the value of assets before Dante's acquisition offer had ever arrived. Whitfield had far more at stake than a failed sale. He faced prison time if Clara's findings became part of a federal case, and he had apparently decided that silencing the messenger was safer than facing the consequences of his own actions. It had taken his people 4 days of careful, quiet digging to build the picture, tracing wire transfers through 3 shell companies registered in different states, each one designed to look unrelated to the others, until you knew exactly what pattern to search for, the same pattern Clara had already found on her own months earlier. Dante had insisted on reviewing every piece of it himself before bringing it to her, unwilling to hand her anything less than certainty. Dante brought the information to Clara personally, laying it out across her kitchen table with a level of transparency he had never extended to anyone outside his own organization. "Whitfield sent someone to your office," he said. "I can't prove it in a courtroom yet, but every thread leads back to him. He's the one who has the most to lose if your report becomes part of a federal investigation." Clara studied the documents carefully, her analytical mind working through the details even as the personal danger of the situation settled over her. "If I go to federal investigators with what I found, and with what you've uncovered about Whitfield, this stops being a private evaluation," she said slowly. "It becomes a criminal case. My name becomes public. My safety becomes a much bigger problem." "I know," Dante said quietly, "and I know what that could mean for you. If this goes federal, they'll want everything, including anything connected to my organization. It's not a small risk I'm asking you to take." Clara looked up at him, searching his face for hesitation, for the moment where his own self-interest might finally outweigh whatever had grown between them. "Are you asking me not to report it?" she said carefully. "No," Dante said immediately, without a single second of doubt. "I'm telling you that whatever you decide, I'll stand behind it, even if it costs me everything I've built. You were the first person who ever told me the truth without flinching. I'm not going to be the reason you stop." The certainty in his voice affected her more deeply than she expected, cutting through months of professional caution and personal guardedness in a way that left her momentarily speechless. She had spent her entire career bracing for powerful men to eventually reveal their true priorities, expecting self-interest to surface the moment the stakes grew high enough. So Dante Rocco, against every instinct she had built her life around, was not doing that. "I need to think," she said quietly. Not about what's true, about how to make sure the truth actually survives contact with people who don't want it to. Take the time you need, Dante said. I'm not going anywhere. He left her apartment that night without pushing further, though every instinct told him to stay, to keep watch outside her door himself, rather than trust the decision to anyone else. He respected the boundary anyway, understanding that whatever they were building together depended on her having the room to make this choice entirely on her own terms. That night, as Clara sat alone in her apartment reviewing the documents Dante had given her, a message arrived on her phone from an unknown number, a single line that stripped away any remaining doubt about the danger she faced. Drop the investigation, or the next visit to your office won't be quiet. She stared at the message for a long time before forwarding it to Dante, along with a short reply of her own. This confirms it. Whitfield is panicking. That means the truth is close enough to hurt him. Dante called her within minutes, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. I'm coming over, he said. Tonight. We finish this the right way. Together. When he arrived, Clara had already laid out a plan across her kitchen table, methodical and precise even under the weight of fear. A woman who processed danger the same way she processed a fraudulent balance sheet, by breaking it into pieces small enough to solve. I need everything you have on Whitfield, she said. Every document, every contact, every thread connecting him to the shell companies. If I take this to federal investigators, with a complete picture instead of a partial one, they'll move fast, and Whitfield won't have time to cover his tracks, or come after either of us again. You'll be putting yourself directly in front of federal investigators, Dante said carefully. They'll ask about your relationship with me. That could complicate things for you professionally. I'm aware, Clara said, but I'd rather deal with complicated than dead. And Dante, I need to know something before we go any further with this. What? He asked. If this investigation eventually touches your organization too, not just Whitfield, will you still stand behind it? Dante met her eyes without hesitation, the weight of the question settling over both of them in the quiet apartment. Yes, he said simply. I already told you. Whatever it costs me. Something shifted in Clara's expression then, a wall she had maintained since the moment they met finally beginning to lower. Not completely, but enough for both of them to notice. Then we do this together, she said, all the way through. 2 days later, Clara walked into a federal building with a folder containing every piece of evidence she and Dante had assembled, her testimony precise, unflinching, and utterly without exaggeration. She did not soften the details connected to Dante's organization, and she did not inflate the crimes committed by Whitfield beyond what the evidence actually supported. She simply told the truth, exactly as she always had, and let the facts speak for themselves. The speed of it surprised even Clara, who had expected federal bureaucracy to move at its usual grinding pace. Instead, agents began pulling records within 48 hours, working through nights and weekends, with an urgency that told her they understood exactly how much damage a man like Whitfield could do if given time to prepare. Investigators moved quickly once they saw the pattern Clara had uncovered, issuing subpoenas for Whitfield's financial records within days. Word reached Dante's organization almost immediately that federal agents were closing in on the shipping company's leadership, and Victor Cole arrived at Dante's office white-faced and furious, certain that everything they had built was about to collapse alongside Whitfield's empire. You let her walk straight into federal investigators, Victor said. Do you understand what she could have said about us? About everything? She told them the truth, Dante said calmly. Nothing more, nothing less. And the truth about my current operations doesn't include what Whitfield was doing. If it did, I'd deserve whatever comes next. Victor stared at him, stunned by the calm certainty in Dante's voice, the total absence of fear from a man who had built his entire life around controlling every possible outcome. You've changed, Victor said quietly, and it did not sound like a compliment. Maybe I have, Dante replied. Maybe it's time. News of the warrant spread through the financial district by early afternoon, and by the time evening fell, reporters had already begun gathering outside Whitfield's corporate headquarters, cameras trained on federal agents carrying boxes of documents out to unmarked vans. Clara watched a brief segment about it on the restaurant's television, feeling something complicated settle in her chest. Relief and exhaustion tangled together with a lingering unease about how much further the case might still reach. That evening, as federal agents executed a search warrant on Gerald Whitfield's offices, Clara sat across from Dante in a quiet restaurant far from the financial district, the first true dinner they had allowed themselves since this began. The threat had not fully disappeared, and both of them knew there would be difficult days ahead as the investigation unfolded. But for the first time since a phone call had ended a $2 billion deal in 10 seconds, they sat together, not as an evaluator and the man she had judged, but as two people who had chosen the same difficult, dangerous truth and chosen to face it side by side. 3 weeks after federal agents raided Gerald Whitfield's offices, a subpoena arrived at Dante Rocco's headquarters, delivered by a young agent who did not flinch under the weight of the stares that followed him through the building. The document demanded access to years of financial records connected to any transaction involving the shipping conglomerate, and it named Dante's organization directly as a party of interest in the expanding investigation. The messenger who had delivered it stood awkwardly near the door for a moment longer than necessary, clearly unsure whether he was meant to wait for a response or simply leave, before Doyle finally waved him out with a curt nod. The room fell into a heavy silence once he was gone, broken only by Victor's footsteps as he crossed the office, subpoena in hand. Victor Cole slammed the subpoena down on Dante's desk with a force that rattled the glass paperweight beside it. "This is exactly what I warned you about," Victor said. "She opened a door, and now the federal government is walking straight through it into our business." Dante read the subpoena carefully, his expression unreadable, before setting it down with a calm that unsettled Victor more than any outburst could have. "Then we open our books," Dante said. Victor stared at him as though he had lost his mind entirely. "Open our books," he repeated. "Dante, do you understand what they'll find if they look closely enough at everything, not just the Whitfield deal?" "I understand exactly what they'll find," Dante said. "Which is why we're going to make sure they find a company that's already correcting its mistakes, not one that's hiding them. I've spent the last several months cleaning up every operation Clara flagged during her reviews. That work continues, faster now, with full transparency." He thought of the dozen small decisions he had made in recent months, without fully naming their purpose to himself, terminating a supplier relationship here, restructuring a subsidiary there, always under the quiet influence of imagining how Clara would evaluate it if she ever looked closely. He had not realized, until this moment, how much groundwork he had already laid without consciously deciding to lay it. Victor sat down heavily across from him, running a hand over his face. "You're going to dismantle everything your father built," he said quietly. "For her." "I'm going to save what's worth saving," Dante said, "and let go of what was never going to survive scrutiny anyway. That's not destruction, Victor. That's the only way any of this outlives me." Clara, meanwhile, faced her own version of the same storm. Federal investigators, impressed by the thoroughness of her original findings, asked her to consult formally on the broader case, a role that would require her to review Dante's entire operation with the same unforgiving rigor she had applied to Whitfield's fraud. She sat across from lead investigator Grace Whitmore, a sharp, composed woman who had clearly seen every kind of evasion and excuse in her career, and considered the offer carefully. "You have a personal relationship with Rocco," Whitmore said bluntly. "That's going to raise questions about your objectivity if you take this role." "I'm aware," Clara said, "which is why I'll recuse myself from any evaluation directly involving him personally, but I can still consult on the broader financial patterns across the shipping industry. That work doesn't require me to compromise anything." The office around them carried the particular hum of a federal investigation gathering momentum, phones ringing in the distance, agents moving between rooms with folders and hurried purpose, and in the middle of it, Clara sat with the same composed stillness she brought to every evaluation, unmoved by the scale of what was unfolding around her. Whitmore studied her for a long moment, weighing the offer against the complications it carried. "And if the investigation eventually does point back toward Rocco's organization in ways you can't avoid," she asked, "what happens then?" "Then the evidence speaks," Clara said simply. "It always has. I've never once changed a finding because of who it might hurt, and I'm not going to start now, regardless of my personal feelings. Whitmore's expression softened slightly, something like respect crossing her face. That's the answer I was hoping to hear, she said. Welcome to the case, Ms. Bennett. Over the following weeks, Clara's consulting role expanded steadily as the investigation uncovered layer after layer of the network Whitfield had helped build. She worked long hours poring over records from companies she had never evaluated before, occasionally recognizing familiar patterns of fraud that echoed what she had already found once, months earlier, in a very different context. Each new discovery deepened her understanding of just how widespread the corruption in the shipping industry had become, and just how rare it had been for anyone to catch it before it grew this large. The weeks that followed tested both Dante and Clara in ways neither had fully anticipated. Dante worked alongside a small team of trusted advisors, restructuring contracts, severing ties with partners who had built their businesses on the same fraudulent foundations as Whitfield, and voluntarily surrendering records that could have easily stayed buried. Each decision cost him money, alliances, and pieces of the empire his father had spent decades building. Each decision also brought him closer to something he had never experienced before, a version of success built on something sturdier than fear and leverage. Clara, working alongside federal investigators, uncovered a pattern that stretched far beyond Whitfield alone, a network of shipping executives who had used falsified compliance records to move questionable funds across multiple companies for years. Her work was meticulous, exhausting, and occasionally dangerous, as more than one implicated executive attempted to intimidate her the same way Whitfield had, only to find themselves facing the same unwavering resolve that had ended his career. The city outside had settled into its evening rhythm, streetlights flickering on, one by one, offices emptying, as workers headed home, entirely unaware of the quiet reckoning taking place inside a handful of shipping company boardrooms. Clara had spent the day fielding hostile questions from opposing lawyers, each one searching for a crack in findings that had none, and by the time she left the federal building, she felt the accumulated weight of months of pressure finally catching up with her. One evening, after a particularly long day reviewing evidence, Clara arrived at Dante's home unannounced, exhaustion evident in the slight slump of her shoulders that she rarely allowed anyone to see. Dante opened the door before she could knock, as though he had somehow sensed she was coming, and studied her face carefully. "Rough day," he said, not quite a question. "Whitfield's lawyer tried to argue that my original evaluation was personally motivated against his client," she said, stepping inside. "Tried to paint me as someone with a vendetta instead of someone doing her job properly." Dante's jaw tightened, an old, familiar anger rising in him before he consciously set it aside. "What did you say?" he asked. "I told the truth," Clara said, a tired but genuine smile crossing her face for the first time that day. "I told him the numbers don't care about motivation. They only care about accuracy, and mine has never once been wrong." Dante laughed softly, the sound warm and unguarded in a way that had become increasingly familiar between them. "Of course you did," he said. They sat together in his kitchen that night, not discussing business or investigations, simply existing in each other's company after a long, difficult stretch of days, and Clara found herself thinking about how strange it was that the man who had once represented everything she distrusted about power now felt like the safest place she had found in months. "I keep waiting for you to resent me for all of this," she admitted quietly, "for what my evaluation cost you, for everything that's still unfolding because of it." Dante considered the question seriously before answering, choosing his words with the same care he now brought to every decision involving her. "You didn't cost me anything I actually needed," he said. "You cost me the parts of my life that were always going to catch up with me eventually. I'd rather lose those pieces on my own terms, standing next to you, than lose everything eventually, standing alone." Clara studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of performance, any hint that his words were calculated rather than genuine. She found none, only the same steady honesty that had first caught her attention across a cafe table months earlier. "That's the first time anyone's ever thanked me for a zero," she said softly. "It won't be the last," Dante replied. "Not if I have anything to say about it." The investigation continued to expand over the following weeks, eventually implicating 3 additional shipping executives and 2 banking officials who had knowingly processed falsified transactions. Whitfield, facing overwhelming evidence assembled largely from Clara's original findings, began negotiating a plea deal that would require him to testify against the wider network in exchange for a reduced sentence. Through it all, Dante's organization remained conspicuously, almost surprisingly clean, a fact that did not go unnoticed by investigators like Grace Whitmore, who had expected to eventually find the same rot beneath Dante's operations that she had found everywhere else in the industry. "You've been remarkably cooperative for a man in your position," Whitmore observed during one of the final interviews connected to the broader case. "Most people in your line of work fight subpoenas with an army of lawyers. You handed us records before we even had to ask twice." "I had a good reason to change how I operate," Dante said simply, glancing toward Clara, who sat quietly nearby, reviewing a final set of documents. "Someone showed me that honesty isn't a weakness. It's just harder to fake than everything else." Whitmore's expression carried genuine surprise as she closed her file, studying the two of them with newfound curiosity. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, she said. "I've never seen an evaluation turn into anything like this." "Neither have I," Clara admitted, a small private smile passing between her and Dante that spoke volumes neither of them needed to explain aloud. "But I've also never met anyone willing to burn down his own house to prove he could build a better one." As the formal investigation moved toward its conclusion, both Dante and Clara understood that the hardest part still lay ahead. Whitfield's testimony would name names, expose remaining vulnerabilities, and force a final reckoning that would determine whether everything they had sacrificed together had actually been enough to secure the future either of them wanted. But for the first time in either of their lives, neither one faced that uncertain future alone. The courthouse steps had been crowded with reporters since early morning, drawn by the scale of the fraud case and the unusual detail, already leaked to the press, that the man who had originally tried to buy Whitfield's company now sat firmly on the side of the prosecution rather than the defense. Clara had braced herself for questions from journalists on her way inside, but none of them recognized her, and she was grateful, at least for now, to remain a quiet, precise presence in a case that had grown far larger than the evaluation that started it. Gerald Whitfield's testimony began on a cold morning inside a federal courthouse, and Dante Rocco sat in the gallery beside Clara Bennett for the first time since the investigation had begun, no longer separated by the careful professional distance that had once defined every interaction between them. Whitfield, gaunt and visibly diminished from the man who had once run a billion-dollar shipping empire, spoke in a flat, defeated voice as he detailed years of falsified records, hidden shell companies, and desperate attempts to silence the one evaluator who had refused to look away from what he had built. When the prosecutor asked Whitfield directly why he had ordered the break-in at Clara's office, his answer landed heavily across the silent courtroom. "Because she was the only person who couldn't be reasoned with," Whitfield said. "Everyone else in this industry understood how to look the other way when the numbers got complicated. She never did. I thought if I could scare her into silence, the whole thing would stay buried, the way it always had before." Clara sat perfectly still beside Dante as the words settled over her. Years of quiet, isolated integrity, finally validated in the most public way imaginable. Dante reached over and took her hand beneath the table where no one could see, a small, steady gesture that said more than any speech could have. Whitfield's testimony implicated two additional executives who had not yet been named in the investigation, closing the final gaps in the case that Clara's original evaluation had first exposed. As the hearing concluded, Grace Whitmore approached them both in the courthouse hallway, her expression carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent months untangling a conspiracy years in the making. "This case doesn't happen without you," she said to Clara. "Both the courage to find it and the courage to keep pushing when it got dangerous." Clara nodded, a rare, genuine smile crossing her face, despite the weight of everything that had happened. "I just did my job," she said. "The rest of it happened because someone finally decided to stand beside me instead of trying to make the problem go away." Whitmore glanced toward Dante, her expression thoughtful. "That's an unusual position for a man in your line of work," she said. "It's the only position worth having," Dante replied. Whitmore studied the two of them for a moment longer, something almost wistful in her expression, before shaking her head slightly and gathering her files. "I've spent 15 years watching cases like this destroy the people who report them," she said. "It's good to see one that didn't." She left them standing together in the emptying courthouse hallway, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply absorbing the quiet, unfamiliar relief of an ending that had actually gone the way it should have. In the weeks that followed the conclusion of the trial, Dante's organization emerged from the investigation smaller, leaner, and fundamentally transformed. He had shed every partnership, contract, and subsidiary that could not withstand the same scrutiny Clara had once applied to the failed shipping acquisition. And what remained was something his father would never have recognized: a business built on structures that could survive daylight rather than depend on darkness. The parting had not been bitter, though it carried its own quiet sadness. Two men who had spent years building something together, finally admitting that they no longer wanted the same future. Dante made sure Victor left with more than enough to start again cleanly, a final gesture of loyalty from an old world to a man stepping fully into a new one, and Victor, for his part, shook Dante's hand at the door with something that looked almost like respect. "You did the thing your father never could," Victor said. "I hope it was worth it." "It is," Dante said simply. After Victor left, Dante stood alone in his office for a long while, looking at the empty chair where his old friend and second-in-command had sat through countless late-night conversations over the years. Change always costs something. He had known that from the beginning. He simply had not expected the cost to feel this much like grief, or this much like relief, both at once. Victor Cole, unable to reconcile himself to the new direction, eventually left the organization on relatively peaceful terms, taking a smaller, independent venture with him, and leaving Dante's inner circle populated by people who understood exactly what kind of company they were now building. She had never sought that kind of recognition, and there was something almost uncomfortable in the way former colleagues who had once quietly doubted her methods now called to ask for advice on their own difficult cases. She answered every one of them patiently, remembering too clearly what it had felt like to stand alone with an unpopular finding and no one willing to back her up. Clara's reputation, meanwhile, had grown into something close to legendary within her industry. Her name became synonymous with evaluations that could not be bought, threatened, or worn down, and independent firms across the country began requesting her specifically for the cases that mattered most, the ones where everyone else had already looked away. One evening, nearly a year after the phone call that had ended a $2 billion deal in 10 seconds, Dante invited Clara to his office after hours, the same building where their story had first begun. She arrived to find the space transformed, stripped of the ornate excess that had once defined it, replaced by something simpler, cleaner, more honest. "You've redecorated," she observed, glancing around the room. "I redecorated everything," Dante said, "starting with myself." He handed her a folder, the same kind she had once used to deliver devastating news across countless negotiating tables. Inside was a proposal for a new shipping venture, fully transparent, independently structured, and designed from the ground up to survive the exact kind of scrutiny that had once destroyed his previous attempt. "I want you to evaluate this one," he said, "properly. No favors, no softened numbers. If it earns a 0, it earns a 0, and I'll walk away from it the same way I walked away from Whitfield's company." Clara studied the documents carefully, flipping through pages of financial structures and ownership records with the same rigorous attention she brought to every evaluation of her career, aware of Dante watching her closely, genuinely uncertain of the outcome despite everything they had built together. Dante watched her work in silence, resisting the urge to fill the quiet with reassurances or explanations, understanding by now that Clara's process required exactly this kind of patient, undisturbed focus. He had learned, over the past year, that the best thing he could offer her in moments like this was simply the space to do her job properly, without interference, without pressure, without anything except the numbers themselves. After nearly 20 minutes of silent review, she looked up at him, her expression unreadable in the way it had been the very first time they met. "This is clean," she said finally. "Genuinely, thoroughly clean. It's one of the strongest structures I've evaluated in my career." Dante exhaled slowly, a weight lifting from his shoulders that had nothing to do with money or business at all. "Then I guess I finally passed," he said, Clara set the folder down and looked at him with an expression that had softened completely from the guarded composure of their first meeting, replaced by something warmer, something that had grown slowly and carefully over the course of a year neither of them could have predicted. "You didn't just pass an evaluation, Dante," she said quietly. "You became a completely different person. That's worth more than any score I could ever give you." He thought back to the man who had once sat across from her at a small cafe table, furious over a lost deal, searching for leverage in a conversation that had nothing to offer him but the truth. That man felt like a stranger now, someone he recognized only distantly, the way one recognizes an old photograph of a face that has since changed shape entirely. He reached for her hand, the same steady gesture from the courthouse hallway, now familiar and unhesitating. "I had a good teacher," he said. Outside the window, the city continued its endless motion, indifferent to the quiet transformation that had taken place inside those walls, unaware that somewhere within it, a man who had once measured his worth in billions had finally discovered something far more valuable, and a woman, who had spent her career refusing to compromise, had finally found someone worth trusting completely. Months later, when Dante's new venture launched successfully, fully transparent and fully legitimate, industry publications called it one of the most remarkable transformations they had ever documented, a mafia empire dismantled from within and rebuilt on honesty rather than fear. Few of them knew the full story behind the transformation, the phone call that started it, the break-in that nearly ended it, or the quiet, unshakable woman who had given a $2 billion deal a zero and changed the course of a man's entire life in the process. Clara and Dante rarely spoke publicly about how it all began, preferring instead to let the work speak for itself, the same way Clara had always insisted the numbers should. But on quiet evenings, when the city lights spread out beneath them, and the weight of everything they had survived together settled into something resembling peace, they sometimes returned to that first conversation in the cafe, the moment a fearless evaluator looked across the table at a man everyone feared and refused to blink. It turned out that the zero had never been an ending at all. It had been the only honest beginning either of them had ever been offered, and together, they had built something worth far more than the $2 billion that started it all.